Hey everyone, and welcome to the Skeptic Hangout, the place where we sit back, relax, and chit chat about intriguing and sometimes controversial topics through the lens of skepticism. With us today is Richard Gilliver from Skeptic Takeout, Laura McGee from Unapologetically Me, and Richard Gill from the Yorkshire Atheist. Today we are going to be talking about evolution. So grab your English tea or your fat-free, no-foam vanilla spice latte and join us as we discuss our great, 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 great,
great, great, great, great, great, great, great.
great, great grandparents.
A few times removed.
This is episode 38, Evolution. All right, guys. So
I'm excited about this episode.
Are you? Do tell why.
Yeah. A couple of reasons. One, because I think evolution is a really interesting topic to talk about, just generally, like the science of it. But also, I feel like I know at least something about it. So it's a minority.
Scrap this episode. We can't talk about things we actually know about.
It intrigued me in your introduction when you were talking about I can't remember the exact wording of the introduction, although we go through pretty much the same wording every week. When you're talking about things that are controversial, and that's the thing with evolution.
Yeah,
it's not pretty, but it is.
But it's not the science of it, and that's.
Yeah.
People want you to, some people, some quarters, some minorities want you to think that it is controversial, and it's not controversial at all.
And so it depends on your definition of controversial, right? So people can make anything into a controversy. So it's controversial because there are people out there for whom this goes against their worldview or their narrative about the world and how it operates. And so it doesn't matter that the science is so solid. It's probably one of the most solidly backed up scientific theories that we've got.
You know, like there's so much in science that my tiny human brain cannot comprehend, like the infinities of the universe and the minutiae of subatomic particles and all of that lot. But evolution is one of those things where once you learn about it, it feels like it's just like, yeah, that completely makes sense. Like, I think the big scale evolution of, like from sea creatures to land-based mammals and whatever takes a few more jumps of the imagination to understand how that all works together. But when you talk about like, I know that I've inherited qualities, physical qualities from both my parents, and that has made me who I am. And then I will pass those qualities on to my offspring and they will pass them on to theirs. Like, that's fundamentally what evolution is, isn't it? Like, so when you've got and that whole idea of like survival of the fittest and natural selection and all of those all come together. So like you can understand how, well, if you've got some sea creature that lives at the bottom of the ocean where it's really dark, and then some of them are able to perceive light and some of them are not, the ones that are able to perceive light are probably more likely to spot a predator that's swimming along their way. And so they're more likely to survive and have children. So that more and more of that specific species will be able to perceive light. And then the ones that can perceive it slightly better than the ones who can perceive it slightly worse are more likely to survive. And suddenly you've got the complexity of the human eye, which, millions of years later, human eyes are a bit rubbish anyway, so that was a share example. But
I know our eyes are not the best eyes out there.
No. But that's another merch line. Human eyes are shit.
Human eyes, not the best.
But like it's those little changes all the time that make sense, and that we see even when we think about farmers who are buying the bulls with the biggest muscles in order to get the calves that they want for the next year's calving season, or people who grow apples who are mixing together and cross-pollinating different varieties of apple that get them the shiniest, the sweetest types of apple. Like all of that is used day to day and is an example, small scale, of like the big picture of evolution. Those small things changing over time, leading to speciation, where one animal suddenly can't breed with things that it was genetically related to in the past, and you have different species of all the different types on the earth. It's amazing and wonderful, and to me at least, is completely intuitively sensible an explanation for what we see in the world around us. And it only seems controversial, like you say, when it specifically doesn't fit the narrative of the religious belief that someone has.
I think it's artificially controversial. I'll put it that way. I think that I agree with both of you that the science is really, really sound, and that the more you learn about the science, the more easily understandable it is, and the more intuitive it is. Unlike, say, astrophysics, where like the more I learn about it, the more my mind is like, okay, I'm on vacation now. Like, fuck this shit. I'm gonna go watch some Scooby-Doo. Yeah.
Did you have you noticed any holes in what I just explained, by the way? Because I said a lot of things that
No, not a lot of holes, but like you did make me think of one thing that that is a common claim, is that well, what we see in evolution is like we see genetic information getting lost, or basically de-evolution, that we don't see evolution, we see de-evolution, and then they point to things like dogs, right? And so now you have the idea of like a blind process versus a driven process, right? And so you have the natural process that happens over millions and millions of years, although it can happen over shorter periods. But you have this incredibly grand natural phenomena, and then you have us breeding something like dogs, like say Chihuahuas, for example, where you're losing genetic material. You're not creating something new. You're not adding material into it. You're limiting it down to get exactly what you want, right? Like a fluffier dog, a bigger dog, a smaller dog, something that's good for hunting versus like guarding or whatever the case may be.
Like it's all to do with needs, though, isn't it, as well? So like, just because something's evolving doesn't necessarily mean it's getting better. It's better,
it's responding to its environment,
the needs of its environment or its food source. If there is a certain animal that was able to see in the past and now none of that animal can see, well, it's because they were probably in a situation in the past where being able to see was a valuable skill to have, and now it doesn't matter. So they have, that hasn't been an advantageous way to, procreate and evolve in that certain direction.
Yeah, and I think like the point that I was trying to make is that it seems to me like the more directed evolution is, the more genetic material is quote unquote lost, right? Like so in other words, people like to point towards the fact that we can control evolution and we can manufacture these changes as being like, well, see, intelligence, like it takes intelligence to make it happen, or sure, it can happen when there's intelligence behind it. But it seems to me like when intelligence is behind it is when it gets the most donkered up, right?
Pugs are worse than wolves. Like we can say that factually. Pugs are worse than wolves.
They're certainly less adapted to a natural environment, right? Like they actually require human interaction in order to basically survive, or else they end up like with mange or eaten or killed or whatever. Yeah, no, I think that we are breeding traits out of animals and plants in order to get a very specific outcome. And great that we can do that. I think that actually really demonstrates evolution and how it works, and it demonstrates our mastery of it. But I think that phenomenon is used in the non-scientific community as sort of like a proof that evolution doesn't work. And my whole thing, like the pushback that I have is, it is proof that it does work because we're using it. We're using the concepts of evolution in order to breed in and breed out these traits that we want. But the fact that we are artificially doing it, not because of an environmental impact or because of any sort of pressure on the species, it's done artificially, then that's why the genetic material gets so messed up. Like you have certain breeds of dogs that are susceptible to cancer or have hip issues when they reach a certain age or whatever, because we've taken what evolution has done, what evolution has built, and we've artificially introduced different, what do you call it, like constraints, right?
And under natural conditions, those specific dogs would have died out and not been able to breed, and therefore we wouldn't see those, would we, naturally?
Or they wouldn't have come about to begin with. Like there just wouldn't be a Chihuahua in nature. Like it doesn't. It's the the balance required for a species to procreate and survive, right? It's just not there in some of these species that we've created.
I still can't get the image of there's fucking hundreds of pugs running through the forests of Romania.
And now we see the mountain pug. Yeah, no.
Yeah. So regarding, you've both touched on some interesting points. Richard gave a good overview. Laura brought up a good point. I think my takeaway from what you've both said, because I'm not overly familiar with the science behind evolution. The point I take away from what you've both just said is that evolution is constantly happening, and there isn't a point of a pinnacle point in any species. It is continuously evolving. And if you have a look back through time, there've been far more species that have died out than there have that have survived and gone on to evolve, because it's not a case of evolution is survival of the fittest and the strongest of each species move on to get better and better and better. But a lot of species just die out because they're not fit for the environment they find themselves in. Whether
it's easy to, I think of evolution as the process to get to today's final result of animals in the world and plants and life. But like our current lineup isn't like the right answer to organisms.
No, and what'll happen in the future is exactly what's happened in the past, either through breeding, like Laura was talking about, or whether it be artificial or natural, through breeding or through environmental circumstances. Species will die. Species will die out, and other species will continue. And of those that continue, it might be the changes that occur to them adapting to their environment that allow them to continue. So the human being of a million years' time, if we're still around, might be a very different creature to the human being of now.
I think they've even done like thought experiments like that with different sci-fi movies and stuff, where we encounter a species that we think is an alien species and it's super different from ourselves, and we end up finding out that it's us from the future.
That's actually one of the ideas that the UFO kind of, when I say UFO, I mean the kind of believers in aliens visiting Earth community actually has, are that these little grey fellas that allegedly visit us and take us and do sexual experiments on us in fun and interesting ways are in fact ourselves from the future. That's one of the kind of ideas out there in that community.
That's a paradox, though.
Well, I'm not.
Yeah. So, but that's sort of one of the things that's really hard to wrap people's minds around in terms of evolution, is that you don't really see it from generation to generation. You see it over.
Because it doesn't happen to anyone. Like, you are not evolving. I'm not evolving.
We are evolving, but not at the rate that we become a whole new species.
No, but like evolution never has or will happen to you, Laura.
Oh, no. Yeah. Once I'm born, I'm the species I was born.
It's generational, isn't it? It's between generations.
Yeah. And I think that's something that it's hard for people to wrap their minds around, is like, so the whole like which came first, the chicken or the egg argument. So if you think about like, what did the chicken evolve from? And we happen to know what the chicken evolved from, because chickens are relatively new. Like when they became domesticated, they used to be like wildfowl, right? And I think they're related to something like the chucker or something. And I'm gonna be wrong, but it's something similar to that. Like there are wild birds out there that are still pretty closely related to what chickens came from. But there wasn't just an egg where it's like, okay, the parent is this wild species and now the child is a chicken, and they're totally different. It's like small changes over time. So each generation, if you look at like the child and the parent, there might be similarities, and that parent and that parent similarities, that parent and that parent similarities. But then you go back like and you look at that child over here and like a parent, say, like 50 or 100 back, and there's now differences, right? Only we're not just talking about 50 or 100 generations. We're talking about thousands, if not millions of generations, right? So like the human species, we could say that like hundreds of generations back, we still look like humans. Like 2 million years ago, we were still hominids, right? So that change to what we would recognizably see as a human to what we would recognizably see as not human, it didn't happen over one generation. And there's not a point you can point to where you're like, that was the generation where they are now human, right? And that's hard for people to comprehend.
Obviously, we were talking about the controversial or non-controversial nature of evolution in terms of, with reference to like various religious groups.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I think is interesting to do with that, I'm a former member of the Church of England, and the Church of England, in terms of its, acceptance of scientific ideas, is quite open and liberal to those ideas. So the Church of England's official stance is that, Big Bang cosmology is correct and that evolution is correct, because that's what scientists say happened. And so therefore, I mean, obviously God did it all, but,
But
they
God did it
accepted
through
those.
these different methods. Yeah.
Yeah. But one of the questions that I think that raises, which is really interesting, is at what point in humans' evolution towards current humanity, from ape-like creatures, at what point were we suddenly humans with souls who were in favor with God? Like at what point along that transition over millions of years from these furry animals to what we could class as people was God like, yeah, you're the guy. Because
Adam is what they would say, right? Like,
yeah.
that dude.
It's a nice name. But yeah, because we don't think of, for example, of animals. I say we, like Christian people, for example, don't often think of animals as having souls, for example, but humans as having souls. And so, when you think about it, was there a generation of pre-human humans that didn't have a soul, but then their children did have souls and therefore went to heaven or what? And this sounds sort of not flippant, but like it sounds like a on purpose sort of awkward question. But if that was the process of things, that's the sort of decision that God would have presumably had to have made along that way.
Yeah.
You know what? This is something I don't think about whatsoever, and I don't give a shit about particularly, just on the basis, and I don't want to be rude to anybody who does think like that, but I've never been religious, so I've never had that. I've never had to reconcile that. And when I look at religious texts, which I do a lot, I don't see anything like that within them. I see, I'm looking at scholars, and the scholars aren't saying that, the early Hebrew people believed that there was evolution. Those people are telling stories about what they actually believed happened, and appropriating stories from other tribal groups who believe very similar things. And
but I know, like I've had like vicars and things say to me in terms of, I do believe in evolution and the Big Bang. And I also just read the stories in the book of Hebrews as an explanation by people in the Bronze Age about what they thought God's ideas were and whatever else. And it's just a poetic, inspirational way of explaining the whys and wherefores of all of that lot, not the mechanics of the creation of the universe. But then it just begs that question all the time, doesn't it? Of, well, which bits are we classing as allegorical? Which bits are we classing as poetic? Which bits are we classing as literal? And
the bits that were appropriate for the belief you hold at the time.
Yeah, I was about to say, and who is the arbiter of all this? Yeah.
Yeah. It sounds reasonable, doesn't it, on the face of it?
It depends
Yeah.
Depends which religious group you want to be along of and which thing you're trying to excuse. I've literally had a conversation with someone. Interestingly enough, it was the first time I met Kenny Lenny, because we were both talking to this guy at the same time. This guy I was speaking to 2-3 years probably. I was in communication with him, and he was very much one of these kind of Christians who would say it's allegorical when it suited him, to the point where the whole of Genesis was allegorical to him, apart from the first lines where God spoke things into existence, because that was important to what he believed. So that was literal. And then the rest of the text, which was written in exactly the same style as that, was all allegorical because it suited him to be so. And I think that's why I said earlier, I don't want to be dismissive of people who have that thing, but I'm interested from a very kind of academic point of view about scripture and stuff. And sometimes people have to reconcile things within themselves about what they believe. And I've no problem with people doing that. That's up to them to have that internal struggle if they're religious and they want to kind of try and find these answers within themselves. But that's not interesting to me, because that is what it is. That's their internal struggle. And that frustrates me in conversation with these people, because to me, it's like watching someone, it's like and again, I don't want to appear rude, but it's like watching a child learn about something for the first time when they believed something was different. And you can see the cogs turning in the brain and the like look of realization on the face. It's like watching that, but without the realization. And it's immensely frustrating to do. It's immensely frustrating. It's for someone with my interests. I've no problem with them believing that and reconciling that within themselves. That's up to them, but it's just frustrating from my point of view.
So you bring up some thoughts with me and I don't want to take away from the point you're making, because I think it's a really, really good point. And but I'm going to take it like it's sort of a different way. But as you were talking,
I want you to, and I appreciate that you've both probably been in that position before that I was talking about. So.
It was thought-provoking, though, because it made me realize we're talking about evolution, but there's multiple forms of evolution, right? And there's multiple ways in which it happens. And one of the most fascinating for me is cultural evolution, right? And religion is a product or byproduct of cultural evolution, and it has changed. Even just randomly pick one religion. I know we talk a lot about Christianity, so we can stay away from that and just randomly pick any other religion, and you can see how it changes cultures and cultures change it, and the survivability of it based on the environment that it's in, which is the minds of the people, right? So when you have a religion that has remained relatively stable over thousands of years, you have an environment in which it's very secure in the minds of the people, not really challenged. There's nothing really threatening its survivability. But then when you start introducing new ideas, new scientific concepts, things that may disagree with that religion, now that religion is in an environment that's more hostile towards it, and it needs to either die out, which many, many, many religions have done, FYI, right? Like we have hundreds and thousands, I say thousands because of all the sects of different kinds of religions out there, even today. Think of how many have died over thousands and thousands of years, like the majority of them. So just like the majority of species that have ever existed are already extinct, right? So it's interesting as you guys are talking about the interplay between evolution and religion and how some religions have come to accept it, but then kind of work it into their narrative. And then you start talking about how individuals tend to internalize their religion and they pick and choose which parts of it work for them and don't work and what's true and what's allegory. You're basically talking about the evolution of religion, right? And it absolutely is, because there's such a strong desire for it to survive, it is changing more and more and more to where more and more religious people now are accepting evolution and accepting the age of the universe, and
Well, likewise on the other side of that coin as well, think about the televangelist, mega churchy, whatever, like the theology that they're preaching will be so different to, someone 50 years ago in the same area might, be appalled at the theology that's being preached now because it is meeting the needs and pressures of the time, which everything you said completely matches the things we were saying before in terms of about, evolution in organisms.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's kind of fascinating because we can talk about scientific evolution and how it works within the animal kingdom, or we'll just call it the organic, kingdom, anything that's alive. But it also happens in different ways. Like you can talk about like the evolution of a galaxy or a star or something like that. But you can also talk about all these different forms of cultural evolution. And that to me is what's most fascinating. Like I like delving into biological evolution. I think that's really neat. And like I could probably talk about that for hours. Then you get me on cultural evolution, and that's where you're gonna completely, like, I don't know. It's where I could just spend hours and hours talking about or going over how things have changed over time to the point where, and I guess the reason it's so important to me is because people today look at their religion or their culture or their traditions and they're like, this is how it's always been. It's like, oh yeah, since the 70s, right? Like, or since the early 2000s, right? We don't have that like scope of really just how different things are now from how they were in the past. We have this sort of sense that things have always been this way.
Yeah, because the thing is, we have relatively short lifespans. I mean, and if you have a look at like when I was thinking about this the other day. I was, thinking back to when I was 10 years old. I was a child. I wasn't much older than my son is, like literally a child.
Mhm.
And that was only 33 years ago. And I've probably lived in all like probability the majority of my life now. I've probably got less time left than
Than
I
what you
had
had.
than
Yeah.
I've had. And it's nothing. It's really a blink of an eye in the grand scheme of things. Even, and I'm not talking about like in the scheme of things going back to the start of the human species. I'm talking literally just back into human memory.
Yeah.
Like I've got a friend who's 93 years old, and he was telling me about he's told me countless times stories about when he was a child in the Second World War, and that's before most people, like that's within our living memory, and it seems so long ago. If you have a
Right.
look at the cultures from then, the practices from then, what people believed, what people, the political beliefs, the
Yeah.
religious beliefs of the time, it's almost a world away from where we are now. What was acceptable, what wasn't acceptable, it's almost an entirely different world, and yet that's within the memory of the lifetime of someone I know.
Yeah, no,
And
yeah. And that's a lot of it's funny you said that. As you were talking, I thought of this book I just recently read called, Sharecropper's Wisdom. It's sort of a leadership book, but it was written by a general, who his father was a sharecropper, which is basically when they, abolished slavery, but they needed to now pay the slaves. They did this thing called sharecropping where it's like, "Well, you can still have your house and we'll let you live on the property and we'll give you a small percentage of whatever money we make." Right? And it was a way of paying them. But he describes all the lessons he learned growing up as a poor black kid, whose father was a sharecropper, and now I think he's a two-star general. Might be a little bit higher than that. But just everything that he learned and me reading that book, I was like, I don't think about the fact that there are still people alive who remember and experience these things like that remember that kind of um discrimination isn't the right word, like disparity between
Yeah.
black and white Americans, right? We like to pretend like all of that was like ancient history, right? And yeah, anyway, so I know it's a sort of a different topic. You're talking about World War II, and I'm talking about like the end of slavery and sharecropping and stuff. But it is very interesting that we think about those things, even like women's suffrage, as being like, well, that happened a long time ago. Like women have
yeah,
been
yeah.
allowed to vote for like ever, right? Like, but no,
But
it
that's
was
how we feel. That's we
yeah,
do feel like I remember when I was young. I don't when well, not when I was young. When my mum was young, she couldn't have a bank account,
yeah,
and
yeah. My grandma, same thing. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just it seems bizarre to us now, but it's like that was the reality. But we don't think about that because we think about where at the most people think about where they've come from in their own lifetime and not much before that. I've got vague memories of what it was like living in the and I lived all the way through the 80s. I lived through the entire decade. I was born in the 70s,
mhm.
but I've got memories of what it was like living in the 1980s, but they're kind of vague.
But
They're
yeah,
not they're
it was
not
formative
like
years. It wasn't really.
Yeah.
yeah, they're not filled with like huge amounts of detail of culture and politics and religion and stuff. I don't know what that kind of landscape was about. I've got like my overriding memories are of things like uh, the Challenger disaster, the
Mm,
and I know slightly after the 80s, this was slightly after the 80s, but the Berlin Wall coming down, those things are the things that like
big
stand
thing.
out to me
Yeah.
from the political or the world stage. So it's and that's my memory which is nothing. It's a blink. That's all it is. And then we've got so much culture coming from behind that, and we do have to step back and like look at things from the wider perspective. For
And I think that's the same with like biological evolution as well, isn't it? Like, it takes a lot of specimens found in the ground in order to build up that bigger picture of animals evolving from one to the other, speciation, the divulgence of species into different branches of the animal and plant kingdoms and what have you. It's that bigger picture idea, which actually, even up until today and moving into the future, we're still building that picture.
I love how you tied it back to biological evolution, because I had it in my mind to do that. Yeah, I'm really glad you did that, because we're about to head off to a commercial break. But I did want to get back onto biological evolution. But I think it's cool to kind of highlight what Gilliver was saying in terms of when you just have that slice of time. Like if you just take a single slice of time, you sort of build this picture of like, this is how it was, right? But you don't have the before and the after, and you don't have the context and stuff like that. And so that's true of both cultural and biological evolution, where all you have is like one moment, one little bitty bit of information, and you have to fit it in with whatever else you come up with. And you're right, it takes a plethora of information to finally build a picture. So maybe we can, when we get back from commercial break, we can get more into how that works, but on the biological side versus the cultural side.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are we doing? Well, what are we doing? I don't know why I said that like that. I am going to be on the non-profits, which I love. I love being on the non-profits. And I don't know who I'm on with. I can't remember who I'm on with this week. So it's going to be an adventure for me as well as for you. it's always
tantalizing.
The last time I was on with that side, McGee. And that was great fun. I always have great fun on the non-profits.
I love it.
It's kind of like our show, but with like research.
I was about to say, but we actually know
like our show, but informed.
Yeah.
Like if we actually did some research. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great show. It's a great show. It's a great crew. Everybody at the AC is great. Anyway, I love doing the stuff I do down there, and so I'm going to be on there on Sunday. So catch that if you can, McGee.
Fantastic. I don't have anything coming up. Yeah, so we can just move right on along to our Facebook page.
Our Facebook page is very good. In conclusion, I talk about it a lot in various different ways, and I can't believe there are still more ways to explain the fact that you should go to our Facebook page, because this is episode 30 whatever, nearly 40 whatever, and I've said basically exactly the same thing every week. So you've got it by now, folks. Go and join the Facebook group. It's a great place to be, to talk about things and share ideas and all that stuff. As well, if you go to our Linktree, you'll find the top link is to our merch store, where you can buy all of the Skeptic Hangout swag that you want. We've got things such as our lovely faces on badges and funny sayings on hats. So yeah, whatever you want there.
I thought we were going to have like a detailed description of many products.
No, it's good stuff. You got to see it for yourself.
You do. A picture paints 1,000 words, and I've definitely probably said already 1,000, so I'll stop there.
Awesome. All right, everyone, back to the show. Okay, so before we went to commercial break, we were talking about kind of cultural evolution and how, from anyone's specific perspective, you kind of have this like slice of history that like that's how it's always been, right? And we talked about the need for broader perspective in order to have like a bigger idea of how things were and how things have changed over time and how recently they've changed versus, oh, it's always been this way or it changed a long time ago. Like, oh no, that was just last generation. So we wanted to tie that back into biological evolution and how, Gil, you had said something about like if you just find a specimen on the ground, that's not good enough, right? Like you have to have multiple specimens in order to determine kind of where it fits in and how it evolved and what it's related to. So let's start talking about that a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think it's for a long time humans have found things in the ground which they thought were interesting, but I guess it's at the point in history where we were able to effectively communicate with other humans at other places, where we were able to actually piece together those jigsaw pieces. You're absolutely right in terms of, having, well, you're right in quoting me when I said that just having one specimen of something doesn't tell us anything at all. It says this is a thing that existed and we can see it here, and you might be able to see some features of it. You might be able to see some specific characteristics of that one example of an organism. But yeah, you can't see those, the patterns of things and the changes. And actually one of the big things that has enabled us to see more into that side of things is like DNA sampling of things. We can see like what percentage of human DNA matches with the DNA of a cucumber or whatever. And some humans apparently seem to have more in common with a cucumber than others. But yeah, certainly it's not some like straight line from the before and the after the finished product. It's more complicated.
Yeah, so things like God, I remember when I was religious hearing something about the missing link, right? Like, well, where's the bones that show us the transition between ape and human or monkey and human? What I'm trying to say is like a lot of people still think like, well, there's no specific set of bones that are like, hey, this one was a monkey or an ape or another primate, and this one's a human, and here's the set of bones that bridges. And what's interesting is we do. So first of all, there is no missing link. That is a huge misconception. Like I don't
There is a
know.
missing link if you cover your eyes like this and refuse to look in the direction
and go la 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 la
everybody's
la with your
pointing.
ears. Yeah. So what we have instead is just tons and tons and tons of examples of intermediary species. I'm saying that word wrong, I feel like. Species that have either more ape-like or more primate-like features, but some human, or more human-like, but some primate. Like we do have a lot of species that sort of have these in-between features, and we have a ton of them. And we can actually show with the amount of specimens that we have, we can show not just our evolution back to apes, but we can also show that it branched, right? Like there were other hominids, which is like two-legged, standing on your legs, walking, rather than walking on the hands and legs, species that co-evolved with us. Like
at least two of which we interbred with.
Yeah, that would be the
We're supposed to talk about,
Neanderthals,
like,
and then
Neanderthals,
the Denisovans, I think, were the other ones. I can't remember.
Yeah, I
The
think
problem with
you're
not
right.
being prepared for these episodes is I forget a lot of labels and names and details and stuff that I could spin myself.
No, I do believe you're right, I think.
Yeah. So, but there's also some that they don't see really close links between us and them. So there's varying degrees of relativity between us and these species. And that is really, really fascinating to me. The idea that so many people still believe that we're missing the information we need to show that we came from primates. Because it's there.
And on the opposite end of that, some people with certain religious bents tend to use that new knowledge that there were multiple species of hominids to justify the Bible. For example, where Adam and Eve had their children, and Cain and Abel married. Where
did the wives come from?
That's one of the questions often asked, and one of the excuses given is, well, we know there were different species, so that's one of the excuses. That's one of the post hoc rationalizations given by some, not all, but some religious people as to try and justify those biblical accounts.
This is really interesting to me because it shows. Oh, sorry, Gil, you can go ahead.
No. You said you were interested.
Well, I was just gonna say that like it really shows that when we're having a discussion about evolution as a topic, there really is no way of just talking about one or the other. They really are very interrelated because the more you talk about biological evolution, the more that the cultural beliefs and teachings and stuff get worked into it, and the more you talk about cultural evolution, the more you need to look at biological evolution in order to sort of like understand it. I think it's sort of fascinating that we can't get around, like when we talk about biological evolution, we can't get around our cultural, religious, and scientific ideas and how those have evolved alongside our understanding of evolution.
And
I was going to say about how it goes back to the ideas we mentioned before in terms of, you think of like earlier attempts in inverted commas of getting to modern humans as if we are the answer to the question, the final finished product. No, we just haven't died out yet. They've already done that, and it's not been our turn to do that yet.
No, definitely.
It's interesting because right now, like, okay, so you talk about an animal being adapted to its environment, and we have discovered ways of bending and shaping the environment to our needs and adapting to our environment in artificial ways, like clothes and heating and cooling and air conditioning. So it's kind of not surprising that as a species, we're starting to sort of flood out all the other species, right? And we're starting to kind of, I hate to say like take over like a bunch of locusts, but we are getting to the point where our evolution is not quite so dependent on what the environment looks like. You know what I'm saying? Like we are artificially creating ways of, like, my skin is pale because I come from a race of people that lived up north, right? But you put me up north now and I would die in like 32 seconds. Because I don't have the capacity to survive in harsh weather right now, right?
Rub it in that you live in the desert and we live in the cold.
No, I'm talking about like surviving, like survival. You guys have your heaters and stuff too, and your blankies and your below zero sleeping bags and all that stuff. Like we have ways of dealing with our environment that sort of cuts off the need for biological evolution. So what I'm saying is we're not the best, like in terms of our adaptability to our environments, but we are right now the best at overcoming our environments, regardless of what they are. Right? Like
it'd be interesting to look at modern human evolution in terms of, because we, like you said, because we don't have as many environmental pressures which focus evolution in the ways that it does in the wild for lots of species. We don't have to adapt to our surroundings biologically. We just adapt with coats and stuff. Like, it would be very interesting to think in what ways are humans evolving, because you think, well, most humans, like, statistically have offspring. So it's not like we as a society say, oh, well, humans like this, we're not going to breed with them because of this specific characteristic. Like, most humans do have offspring.
Mm-hmm.
And so it'd be interesting to see, which characteristics are we as a species losing or gaining or are becoming more prevalent. We talk about how, like, humans, generally speaking, seem to be becoming taller generation by generation, for example. That's one sort of trend in humans in sort of recent generations. But, like, what other ways are we evolving at the moment?
I think it's interesting that when we're talking about kind of, I know we've kind of gone off it a little bit, but something, I can't remember what was said, but something you said kind of reminded me of this. When we're talking about kind of the religious aspect of stuff and people, religious ideas, and one of those in the West or in the Christian ideal being monogamy. Mm-hmm. And I heard somewhere a biologist speaking whose area this was a speciality of, I believe. So I'm not just talking shit that I've just heard some guy on the internet say. Right. This was a biologist whose area this was a specific study of. And apparently the human penis is actually made to both inject its own sperm and remove the sperm of the previous sexual partner.
Keep going.
Go.
This is so exciting.
Last episode was the clitoris episode.
This will be semen. Oh, perfect. No, there's a substance, but not
I'm
all.
so clipping Laura
this
saying
is great.
semen. Perfect.
Not all sperm are designed for inseminating eggs. Some sperm is designed to attack other men's sperm. So I think that is fascinating. So you're right. We are biologically designed to compete with other mates, not just socially, like, oh, I'm the alpha male, but biologically through our sperm and stuff, which means women were having sex with multiple men. And that their sperm was having to compete for fertilizing the egg.
See, all I can imagine is two scientists in a room, two blokes, scientists in a room, being like, I bet my sperm could beat up your sperm.
There's one way to find out. Get the microscope out, guys.
The thing is, as well, if in all seriousness, if that is the case with the human penis and the sperm and everything, that must have been going on for quite some time for it to have evolved in that way. So when you look at it, we're talking like
anthropologically.
I'm great with words, I'm great with words. A great orator. It must have been going on the majority of the human species, like as for the majority of time we've been around, relatively. So all these ideas about kind of monogamy and things like that, they're relatively new as far as a species goes.
Oh yeah,
which it ties
evolved those characteristics in the first place.
I'm just thinking about what Laura said earlier about the two kind of areas tying in really well together, and that's one very, very good example about cultural evolution and kind of physical biological evolution. How they really do gel very well together.
Yeah, and the other thing that I think, like, especially in terms of what you're saying, like, okay, so now we've had predominantly monogamous cultures for a while now. Not all cultures are monogamous. I think that's very, very, very important to point out. I think that a lot of the industrialized sort of more advanced world is predominantly monogamous, and we could talk cultural evolution wise why that is, but that's not even really important. It just is what it is. But you'll notice that, like, biologically we're still wired to compete, and that just goes to show that, like, evolution doesn't happen automatically, and it doesn't always change to adapt the person to be the most adapted to every single environment. It happens when there's a pressure or a need to, or like, it's not just an advantage in having children, it's an advantage that what am I trying to say?
I'm not sure.
There is such a thing as good enough, right? And if an evolutionary trait is good enough, that organism can pass its genes on to the next generation, like basically have children before dying, then it's not going to be removed from the evolutionary gene pool, right? So the fact that we have sperm that is designed to fight off other sperm, there's no need or pressure to eliminate that from our biology, right? Like, it will probably remain in our biology indefinitely because there's no pressure to remove it. But our systems still work. The way that our systems are wired, we are still fully capable of producing offspring prior to dying, right? So there's no evolutionary pressure. But that brings me to the next topic that I'd love to have you guys talk on a little bit if you guys know anything about it, which is how evolution actually works. Like, is it an actual process or what? Because I have my take on it.
I can tell you now that Richard's
he's off with his kitties.
Not going to be a natural process of them not surviving much longer.
One thing that I think is really interesting, and it's not necessarily something you've just said, Laura, actually, so I might be divulging slightly.
No, that's okay.
When we talk about evolution, we often talk about it as if evolution is an agent of action and change,
Yeah, that's
which I think is interesting because we often talk about it as an opposite idea to a creator God who did this thing. No, evolution did this. Or, and I think we've all possibly been guilty of personifying evolution in that way, or anthropomorphizing evolution, when actually, it's just our way of describing a process of things that happen without some sort of guiding hand or agent. I just had to say that out loud before I forgot, because it was something I was thinking about.
No, that's exactly the point that I was trying to make, because people have
Yeah.
this perception that evolution is sort of an active process. Like, oh, if
Yeah.
an animal is put into an environment that is having a hard time surviving, something kicks in and happens and causes evolution to happen. And there is something to be said about gene expression and genes turning on and off, but in terms of actual evolution, it's quite different. So I was
And most of the time it's just accidents. So, like, when I was back when in 1990, when I was a sperm and egg, like when I was sort of first formed from those cells, like, yeah, my genes nowadays, my DNA was like created. It came to be, but like, it's not like I'm physically 50% my dad and 50% my mom.
right.
There's other stuff going on there as well. Genetic accidents happen, and sometimes in animals, it's like you were saying, like, it's not like suddenly an animal decides, oh, maybe if I could see better, I would be able to better protect myself from predators, or maybe if my shell was a little thicker, I'd be able to better defend against predators, or whatever it is. It's just sometimes they might accidentally just have a child whose shell was more resistant to temperature differences or whatever it is, and they just happened to do better. And it's not a case of, yeah, like you said, those animals can't just decide to have thicker shells or slimier skin or whatever it is that they need as that advantage. You look at the variation within humanity. We've talked about how we don't have that evolutionary pressure in terms of our environments, or for mate selection to a certain degree, but there's a crazy amount of variation within humans, and you imagine every animal that's ever existed, there's that variation within those species as well, and some
Right.
things just win out.
And they win out because it helps them to survive. So that's what is so confusing about evolution if you don't really know how it actually works. And I had a really good example that I used to show my kids, and that was on the cellular level, right? Like, you have a cell with a slightly thicker cell membrane and a cell with a thinner cell membrane, and then it comes in contact with, say, some form of acid or another like chemical, right? And that chemical touches the thinner cell wall and it dissolves the cell wall, and that cell dies. Well, now that cell can't replicate. So now the thinner celled walled organism is dead prior to replication and doesn't have any offspring. And then you have the one with a thicker cell wall, and it bumps up against that chemical, and it's able to survive that chemical, and it's able to continue to live. And then it splits and it turns into two cells. Well, now you have two cells with that thicker cell. And if a cell is born that just happens to have a thinner wall, it is more likely to get killed off prior to replication. And if a few survive replication, then they're still a part of that organism or species. They're still a part of that population. But over hundreds, thousands, millions of years, they don't have the numbers to continue to survive, right? And so it really is elegantly simple, but incredibly complex, because we talk about it, like you said, in terms of
It's an
anthropomorphizing.
infinite number of tiny changes.
Yeah. Or we should say like uncountable, because I'm sure that like
a very big number.
a large
I think
number.
one of the issues that lots of people have with the idea of evolution is that idea of, but how did we get from there just being non-living matter on Earth to suddenly there being organisms and things? Jilva, did you want to talk about that?
Yeah, that for me is in where I mean, as I said, I know very little about the mechanisms of evolution itself, so I couldn't really answer Laura's question anyway about how it works. But that evolution in kind of religious circles is very much often compared with kind of creation. But of course, evolution, and I think we mentioned this on the episode that we had Kenneth Leonard on when we were talking about creationism. Evolution isn't the direct kind of thing to creationism. Evolution is just how life changes. It's not how life began. And
Right.
life had to begin in some way, and the kind of I don't know if it's the leading. Don't want to say it's the leading, but certainly one of the most popular kind of scientific ideas about how life began is abiogenesis, and that's that there was this primordial soup on Earth, and when Earth was very different and it had a very different environment to what it's got today, and life somehow came into being. And I think that's very misunderstood by the kind of creationist crowd, because and it's not a proven theory. It's still only a hypothesis. So and again, that's something else that's jumped on quite a lot. That, well, it's not a theory, so how can it be true? You don't know it's true because it's not a theory yet. But this soup was in the had the conditions to kind of for life to form within it, and it wasn't just kind of pop into existence and from
there's a whole
nothing.
cell.
And there was so much time. The early Earth, we're talking, how long was it? Something like 1 billion years, 2 billion years for this process to take place. It wasn't just an overnight process,
right,
where life just popped into existence. There was so much time for this soup to form the correct kind of I mean, I don't know the process, so I can't speak on it in any kind of technical way, but was it RNA that was formed first?
Yeah.
And then which eventually formed into DNA. And there was so much time for these chemicals to actually form and make that. And there'll have been so many failures along the way. Again, like we were saying about how most of the species and things that had lived on Earth have died out over time. I suspect this is the same thing. The most of the not attempts, that makes it sound like it was guided. Most of the opportunities for these things to happen didn't, because there wasn't. Go on.
Go ahead. No. Go ahead.
I was killing it. I was crucifying it anyway.
You're talking about a couple different things. First, you're talking about abiogenesis, which is just getting life from non-life. This is just the word that we've kind of given it for that bridge between life and non-life, right? How do substances that aren't alive suddenly become alive? But then there's the whole theory of the primordial soup, and I think there's other theories out there too. That one might be the bigger one. But what you're talking about is just chemical processes. So this is where it's really fascinating. Yeah. Everything kind of comes back down.
That's what I tried to say. That's what took me 10 minutes in a really roundabout way to say.
So you have like different chemicals in different environments, right? Like you might have the ocean and it has certain chemicals, but even within certain parts of the ocean, there's different chemicals. So let's pretend this is just an idea that like you have like a pond, and that's where this primordial soup was, just this tiny little contained pond, which I don't think this is how it happened, but just as an example, right? That pond has all kinds of different chemicals in it, and they're going to react in different ways. You have to get the right chemical reactions, right? Just to get a simple molecule of say like a amino acid, right? Amino acids aren't technically alive, but they're the building blocks of proteins that become parts of our body and parts of our systems, right? Like we need those proteins as part of our chemical makeup. So you have these little bits and pieces of little amino acids here and amino acids there, and then they form together to form these other things. The odds of exactly the right chemicals coming together at exactly the right time have to be like mind-boggling, right? Because they have to exist within the same natural environment to begin with. And of all the things that exist on our Earth, most things don't create a chemical reaction that creates an amino acid, right? And I think this is what you're trying to say, right? Is that it takes the billions of years, and it takes the changes in the environment and weather changes and weather patterns that move chemicals this way and that way in order to get the right combination of the right chemicals just to have an amino acid. And then you need enough of those around in the same place just to have like a compound, like an actual full protein, right? And then you need enough of those proteins in the same place just to get RNA. But what it really comes down to is just it's just a chemical reaction. It's just a chemical process.
Just that
And
Lots
time.
and lots and lots of
and
time.
lots of time. Yeah. And I think that's what people
And
get
when
hung
we're
up.
talking about billions of years, that's that sort of level of time that we find it difficult to comprehend, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think it's something like to live a billion seconds is like what 31 and some odd years. I'm actually going to Google this, but a billion is an exceptionally large number that
I
we
think
take
it's
for
something
granted.
like a million seconds is like 7 or 8 days, but a billion seconds is 31 point something years.
Yeah, I'm actually Googling it right now. 1 billion seconds in years. Here it is 31.7 years. Okay, so that's just seconds. Now think of a billion years, right?
Yeah.
So it is kind of a mind-boggling number. And God, what am I trying to say? Like a lot can happen in that amount of time.
Yeah, you think about
Yeah.
like to one person in one place, how many possible things happen in even just a day compared to an entire planet over the course of a billion years. Like there are
And
just
this is
so
what
many
we were
things.
saying earlier, isn't it, about the human being in our living memories not actually being that long.
Yeah.
And so we don't truly comprehend these huge numbers for what they actually are, because they are but if you sat them down and thought about it, they are bogglingly big.
Yeah, which is why I think it's good to simplify it, like what we were saying, like evolution, micro versus macro evolution. So macro evolution, which is changing, like for example, it's what people would call like say changing from one species to another, right? Which is what we don't observe happening in real time. We don't necessarily observe the formation of a full new species in real time. And it's because of those mind-bogglingly huge numbers, right? Like you need the thousands of generations, you need the thousands of years, millions of years. You can have shorter evolutions, right? And we could get really into the weeds with that, but um, I think that is where skepticism really kicks in with evolution and like not really understanding how it happens, because you have to first be able to wrap your mind around the first you take this what was a very simple process, but then you have to push it out to such a long period of time and get each little tiny piece to come together just to form a cell, right? And then to get those cells to replicate. So yeah, I think that's where you lose like a lot of people. Like that's where you get a lot of skepticism and a lot of, well, do you really know what you say you know about evolution? Because yeah, you really have to comprehend those big numbers.
Final thoughts?
I'm going to paraphrase or even possibly steal from Bob Ross.
I love it.
The famous evolutionary biologist.
Famous, yeah. Because a term's just sprung into my head, which really reminds me of Bob Ross, and it seems to fit very well with evolution, and that's happy little accidents.
Oh, I love Bob Ross's happy little accidents. Yeah.
And I think that, there's no intention behind it. There's no we're happy little accidents, and one
That's
day
the middle
we'll not.
name of 2 of my children.
Only 2 of them.
Only 2 of them.
One day we're not going to be here anymore, and that's fine, because we, like the majority of species that have ever lived, will one day die out. So let's do the best we can while we're here. That's my final thought.
I like it. That's very dark and deep and poetic.
How depressing a way to end that.
I'm kind of sad now. Thank you for that.
My final thoughts were specifically to do with sort of the subject matter, but in a more sort of meta way. In terms of, I'm just really thankful for the fact that I live in a country where, on the whole, this isn't a sort of contentious issue. The fact that it's taught in schools as scientific fact, I think, is absolutely right. And Yeah, I know that's not the case for everybody everywhere. You know, being a proponent of scientific education does not mean that anyone is attacking religious freedoms and liberties or anything like that, because actually there is so much awe and wonder that can be gained from looking into these things, understanding them as well as we can, that it's just a shame when people don't have the opportunity to experience that.
I really like the way you put that. My closing thought would just be sort of a reminder, but also sort of a challenge. Like we are here just three skeptics talking about a subject, right? So we never know where it's going to go. So our purpose isn't to teach what evolution is or all the nuances, but I think we were all kind of interested in it, and we all kind of got into that a little bit. And I would love to do like even multiple shows breaking down how it actually works, but that's just not the scope of our show specifically. And so that's just kind of a reminder. Like we just kind of talk about whatever we want to talk about, and it goes where it goes. But evolution is a very, very beautiful, very like lots of evidence for it. There's a lot we do know about it. There's a lot we've observed like within our own lifetimes about it. So I would say if you're confused by evolution or how it works, um, get more into the weeds with it. Do more research because it's very, very fascinating. And there's a lot to still be skeptical for, like what Gilliver was saying in terms of abiogenesis, which is different from evolution. But there's a lot we do know. So go find out what some of that stuff is. Go watch some videos or read some research papers or whatever you're up for. But we we are not the science educators. We're just the ones sitting around our desks talking about it. And so I just want to encourage everybody, if they're curious, to do more research and learn more themselves. Thank you two for the conversation, and thank y'all for listening, and we will catch you next time. In the meantime, we are Laura,
Richard,
and Richard. You've been watching Skeptic Hangout. Until next time,
keep questioning.
Interrogate your beliefs.
And please stay skeptical.
Yes. Bye.
Hurrah.